Good afternoon and welcome back to our summer university. This is session 3, Elements in US, EU and UK Architecture Looking to 2030. Thank you all for joining us. Throughout this session, we encourage the audience to submit their questions through the chat box, and the audience should make sure they are on mute, and you both, of course, should ensure that you are not on mute. This session is recorded and streamed, and therefore we are not operating under the Chatham House rule. I would like to introduce you now to the session's moderator, that is Flick Drummond. She's a Conservative member of the Parliament. Flick, thank you for chairing. Over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Felix, and welcome everybody to this session. And thank you, Your Excellency, so much for attending this afternoon, which I hope is going to be a really wide-ranging discussion. João Vale de Almeida is the EU ambassador to the UK, having previously been the EU ambassador to the US from 2010 to 2014, and to the UN from 2015 to 2019. So we're in very good hands this afternoon for a wide-ranging discussion on some of the world's challenges for this decade, particularly with regard to, obviously, the UK, the US, and the EU. But I thought perhaps, Your Excellency, we would start this afternoon with the big topic of the moment, which is the withdrawal of the NATO troops from Afghanistan, and what impact, if any, there is on the existing world order. Following Biden's speech last night, is this the end of interventionism in other countries? And what does it mean for liberal democracies like the US, UK, and EU countries? What are your initial thoughts on it?
Well, first of all, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for moderating this session. It will be a pleasure to engage with you. Please call me João instead of other references, because if I can call you Flick, we'll be in more amicable terms. Let's put it this way. Listen, a real pleasure to be here. A real pleasure to talk to young people looking forward to their future, the role of their generation in the way the world is governed. So a real pleasure to do it. Let me start by saying that I would summarize my reaction, my initial thoughts on post-Afghanistan withdrawal with the following. I think it is a wake-up call for the European Union and an alarm bell for transatlantic alliances, plural, and the West in general. Why do I say this? I think it should be a wake-up call for the European Union, for the countries that belong to the EU, in terms of strengthening their capabilities on the external front, strengthening their autonomy as well, in terms of their defense and security, and the capacity they have to project their interests and their values around the world. It has to do with security and defense, obviously, but it has to do with technology. It has to do with budgetary means, financial means dedicated to the external action. It means an increased degree of hard power. We are a soft power entity. The Brussels effect, the regulatory impact we have around the world in a number of areas, but we are not a hard power. And I think that it becomes more obvious after the events in Afghanistan that we need to step up our efforts there. As far as the transatlantic alliances are concerned, I think this is an alarm bell. I mean, the alarm bell is ringing in terms of the need to reevaluate, maybe rebalance, and certainly not to allow this relationship to be weakened. This is not what we need right now, but we certainly need a good reflection, an analysis of what happened and why, and the reassessment on the way forward. NATO remains the pillar of European security. This is enshrined in the Treaty of Lisbon, which is our constitution. But this does not mean that the EU should not develop further its own autonomous capacity. And in that sense, I would say that more EU in this area does not necessarily mean less NATO. For me, it will mean a better NATO and a more balanced Atlantic relationship.
Okay, so unpicking that a little bit, I mean, there's been talk of a EU army, military of some description. Are you saying then that we really should be relying on NATO and perhaps bringing some of the other countries in as well? Or are we going to start looking at the EU as itself starting to build its own army or military?
I never understood the concept of strategic autonomy, which is words that you may already have heard in European debate about these kind of issues. I never saw it, and I think my leaders support me on this. We never saw this as an alternative to NATO. We saw this reflection, this movement, this discussion as complementary to NATO. That's why I say more EU is not less NATO, is a better NATO. If the EU countries, those who are members of NATO, but not only those who are members of NATO, develop their capacity to act abroad in defense and promotion of their interests and values, this will strengthen NATO itself. It will strengthen our transatlantic partners, and I believe that includes the United Kingdom, in our collective approach to the challenges that we have today, which are extremely important, extremely complex, and which deserve and require that each of the elements of these alliances tries to do as well as it can. Of course, we need to draw from these events a trend that I witnessed when I was representing the Union in the United States, and you've witnessed that as well, is that there is a trend in the United States. You know, Americans don't want to be the policemen of the world anymore. That is obvious, that is clear. It's not from yesterday. By the way, this should not come as a surprise. It was visible during the Trump years, during the Obama years, and even before. And if you travel around the US, as I did in my job, you see that even clearer outside Washington and outside New York and outside LA or San Francisco. This should not come as a surprise. So we need to put all this into equation, but, and this is one of the main points I'd like to make, we cannot, this is not the moment to weaken the transatlantic alliances. It's the moment to review them, but to strengthen them ultimately, not to weaken them. And so I see this, if the EU strengthens its capacity, it's good for the other transatlantic partners. If we develop an agenda we started now with this American administration, which should not be a victim of the events in Afghanistan, we can promote a better role for Atlantic countries. And that includes the UK, who has to make its own choices, of course, about how to place themselves in this framework. But so I think wake-up call for the EU, alarm bell for the transatlantic relations, and hopefully this will result into maybe a more balanced relationship, but it has to be and remain the pillar of and also in the face of the challenges that we have around the world, and you mentioned illiberal democracies, not to call them differently, we have challenges ahead of us, and the generations that will follow ours will have these huge challenges. So they need to be equipped to promote and defend and protect our interests and our values.
Now, talking about challenges, I've just been doing the Royal College of Defence Studies course over the last year, and we had to write an essay on the two challenges, until 2030. What would you say would be the two main challenges up to 2030 for the world, for peace, prosperity, and security?
Yeah, I anticipated your question. So a while ago, I tried to put down on paper what will be the main challenges. I can't reduce them to two, okay. But I would say the following. I think the first one is fear. The second one will be lack of memory. The third one, I would say demography. And the fourth one, what I would call a deficit of advocacy. and self-confidence. And I think with these four and their ramifications, we can at least start to understand where we are and seek ways out of this situation. For fear, I mean, I would not like to see our countries, the West, if you want, to retrench themselves, to fall into isolationism, or to become sort of fortresses, afraid of the rest of the world. I don't think anything good would come out of that. Lack of memory, of course. I lived 17 years in a dictatorship, and every time I see people that only know democracy or only know Europe, United Europe, I think we have a duty to remind themselves that the alternative to democracy is not necessarily better. On demography, I think it's obvious. Our countries are getting older and older, and this is not sustainable, neither from an economic point of view, nor from, if you want, a civilizational point of view. The fourth point of deficit of advocacy, I think we are, if I compare the attitude of those who are Democrats and liberal Democrats and believing in the values that we believe in, I would like to see all of us being more assertive and more present in the debate, defending our ideas and our values. I think that our opponents are more vocal. I like to say that the opponents are more vocal than the proponents. And I think this is the case in the debate that we have today between democracy and non-democracy. So, some elements for discussion.
So just picking up on one of those then, you talk about demography. The aging population really is only in the West, perhaps Japan as well. And then you look at some of the developing countries where, the average age is, well, if not in the teens, in the 20s. That is going to be the biggest pressure then, would you not agree? Particularly on migration and the prosperity perhaps of the world.
Yeah, when I say demography, I talk about the two sides of the equation in demography, right? The negative side on our side, the positive side on other countries, which raises a number of issues. We will need immigrants, period. But we don't see our societies really ready to welcome immigrants. I'm not referring to any country in particular, but I could. How do we square this circle about the need for labor force and the fear of foreign labor force? On the other hand, how can we, stop migratory flows if we don't create jobs in those countries? And how do we create jobs in those countries that are sustainable? And that comes to the whole issue of development aid, the principles, the rules, what other countries do in these countries. The effectiveness of multilateral institutions and foreign aid. So it's a big area of policy action and reflection, but one that we cannot avoid and we cannot ignore.
So if liberal democracies are sort of coming back on themselves, which seems to be one of the fallouts that we've seen in Afghanistan, who do you believe is going to fill that space? Was China going to, or Russia? Which of those are we going to have to fear most?
Yeah, there is no vacuum in international relations, and someone would use the opportunity. That's clear. We should not be naive about that, and we should be clear-eyed in the way we approach the next stage. I think this requires first and foremost unity among us. That's why I said earlier, divisions is the last thing we want today in the Western world, in the transatlantic partners, among the transatlantic partners, for instance. It requires unity of purpose. It requires a vision. Where are we going? I think that the Afghanistan case raises the issue of how do you sort of combat terrorism, and at the same time help create the foundations for democratic states. But the recent experience show that nation building has its limitations. So we need maybe to find a way an alternative way of promoting our values, protecting our interests, helping countries go on the right path, helping people and women and girls in particular in this case, but without falling into a situation where we are trapped to some extent, and at the end of the day have to withdraw. And in doing so, as you were saying, we open the ground for other countries who do not necessarily share our values. So, replying more directly to your question, I think we have to start with the regional powers that are, of course, very attentive and very interested, and then to other powers further away, but equally interested. The problem being for Europeans, and that is valid for the UK, this is our neighborhood. This is not too far from us, and it adds to the problem.
Yeah, I mean, who's going to lead that vision? Biden doesn't seem to want to. It's the EU who've got lots of different elections coming up. There doesn't seem to be any leader that really wants to put that vision forward. Who is, and in the UK too, we've done our integrated review, which is very much dependent on other countries all working together. But what you do need is that leadership to really enforce that vision. Do you think Biden is going to do that, or can you see an alternative to that within, the Western democracies? I
think, first of all, we are democracies, so it has to come from the will of the voters as well. It's not, leadership, top-down leadership. It's the leaders need to be supported by public opinion. And as we are talking, I guess, to a number of younger people, I think it has to come from them as well. It is the world that we're talking about is the world they will have to live in, that they will govern one day. And I think there has to be more of this kind of discussion, this kind of awareness about where the world is going with younger generation. It has to be done in parliaments, House of Commons and House of Lords. For instance, we have to create, enough sort of public awareness and public support for the leaders to make the right choices. You see, so I think this is a societal challenge more than a leadership challenge in a way. But this being said, if I may make this comment, I've seen the reactions to the Afghanistan events that are somehow curious. You've seen on the left and on the right, on the far left and the far right particularly, high degree of criticism of American interventionism. Or these people who used to criticize American interventionism as the same that are criticizing American non-interventionism. So there's a contradiction here. And so we should avoid that kind of contradiction and basically understand that America is evolving. I'm not commenting on aspects of the withdrawal itself. I think it's too early, by the way, to know exactly what happens. I know debates are going on as we speak in the House of Commons on these issues as well. So it's not for me to make a judgment. I'm just talking about the big trends. And the clear trend is that the US is reducing its willingness to act outside its own borders, and we need to factor that in. But that does not mean that suddenly we don't count on the US, that the US is no longer important, and that we don't need the US, and that the US does not need us. It's more complex than that. So I think once this shock or aftershock of the withdrawal of Afghanistan calms down, I think we need to have this reflection about how to move forward. As we're talking about the EU, we're talking about EU-UK, we're talking about NATO, we're talking about G7, G20, United Nations, multilateral system. How are you going to move forward?
Yeah, I mean, one of my concerns is that with the rise of populism, that people, that politicians aren't going to make those very difficult decisions sometimes, as, for instance, going into Afghanistan in the first place, because you are committing, your armies to, and young service people to big risks. So, is that going to be a big concern for the future, and who is going to be that person? Maybe they haven't appeared yet, and you're right, maybe they do come from the younger politicians, but it's a very brave decision to say, we want to lead the world because we think our systems are better than yours. And at the moment, my worry is that there's going to be a vacuum which will be filled by the likes of China.
Yeah, I attended the G7 summit in Cornwall. I was, of course, supporting my two leaders there, and I came out of Cornwall with some positive impressions about the capacity of the G7 to move forward. So we're talking about the return of America to the forum, the return of the forum itself in a physical way, also the arrival of a number of new members of the G7. So the atmosphere in Cornwall, apart from other side events, was one of, this is a body that can maybe exercise leadership. And well, I still believe in it, let's put it this way, even after Afghanistan. And I think we should continue to bet on the G7 and other bodies, but also on our bilateral relationship with the US, maybe trilateral initiatives among us. We should continue to believe that this is the right way forward. And again, I think the last thing we need is an Atlantic withdrawal after the Afghanistan withdrawal, in the sense that the last thing we need is for the Atlantic countries to be divided. They need to have a conversation, of course. I think there is a need for a conversation across the Atlantic, and I hope it will take place soon within the G7 as well. And the Prime Minister called a special meeting the other day. I think this conversation has to continue so that we can find solutions. I think it has to evolve the multilateral system, and the Secretary General, whom I know well, I know he's very concerned by these new situations. And we want to support multilateral solutions as well. So there's a lot down the road on this agenda. But about populism, let me say, just once we talked earlier about the major threats for liberal democracies. Populism is one of them, of course. It's across the board, horizontal one. I think what I've seen in the countries I've been serving in the last 15 years or so, both Europe and US and UK, is, populists are they provide simplistic solutions for complex questions, but that does not mean that some of their questions are wrong. And I think what we should all do, those Democrats like us should do, is to fight their solutions, but recognize that some of the questions need proper answers. And I don't think we have done enough of that in the liberal democracies. And this explains here and there the success of populists. So I was referring to the deficit of advocacy and self-confidence. I think we need to redress that if we want their simplistic solutions to be fully deconstructed and fully explained.
Okay. So moving on a little bit, I'm just quite interested in your views on multilateral institutions then, which you've sort of passed on. So NATO, we can make stronger. What about the UN, where you spent some time there? Is that up for renegotiation, renewal, reforming? What can we do to make that a better place to keep the peace?
I think one principle I like to apply to what I do, and I think should be applied to international relations in general, is that we should avoid to throw the baby with the bathwater. And if we find that the UN is not totally effective, the solution is not to close down the UN. Because one thing I'm sure of, if we wanted to create the UN today, we would not be able to do so. So before we throw the baby with the bathwater, let's rather take care of the baby and nurture the baby and reform the baby, in this case, the United Nations. And that's the sense of what we started doing with the current Secretary General Antonio Guterres in New York, in excellent cooperation among EU member states, where when the UK was still a member state. But I know from my colleagues that is still the case in New York with the UK post-Brexit. I think we have a lot to do now with the Americans. We could not do it in the last 4 years, but now it is possible. And I think reform, effectiveness, providing solutions, being more nimble, being more agile, and at the same time more political. I think that's absolutely in our interest. If I take another case, WTO, the World Trade Organization, or the World Health Organization, they both require reforms. And that's where we need to join forces to make sure that these reforms go in the right direction. Because there are different interpretations of multilateralism, I can tell you.
Yeah.
The word is the same, but behind the word, the concepts are very different. So our vision of multilateralism is, of course, the one we need to protect and defend.
Yeah, because we've got, we haven't really spoken about China yet, and that influence on the Transatlantic alliance as much as anything, because of course, with the US now focusing on the South China Sea, and rather hoping that Europe will provide its own security against Russia, is that going, and yet, it's one of our biggest trading partners, China. Do you think that there's going to be any pressures there on our transatlantic relationship between Europe and America as they perhaps become more belligerent towards China?
Yeah, I think this is, some people call it the elephant in the room. You call it what you want. The question, the fact is, China is in our minds, and in most of the topics we mentioned today, of course, there is a Chinese dimension that we need to get. First of all, because it is a big country, because it is a powerful country. Because it's a country that contributes to a large extent to the growth of the world economy, creates many jobs in our countries as well. So we need to, we cannot ignore China. That's clear. The other thing is, how do we approach China? Should we define individual approaches? Should we try to cooperate? I think there's a sense today among certainly within the European Union, that goes without saying, but also between us and the US, and I hope also between us and the UK, that we need to compare notes, share our own assessment of relations with China, and without ganging up against China. No one wants to do that. I think we need to have a more coordinated approach to relations with this important global power. And we certainly know that the US is fully focused on that. So if it was not for other reasons, this is a very good reason for us to think further about it. And I know there's a debate in the UK. I've been listening to my good friend Tom Tugendhat, who is very vocal about this issue. And we've been following this debate. There is a debate in Europe as well. So on this, I think we made an interesting contribution a couple of years ago in Europe when we sort of defined our relationship with China as being, or China as being a partner, a competitor, but also a systemic rival. And I think these three elements that you can sort of, organize in different ways, but I think they kind of summarize the complexity of our relationship with China. But the issue of being a systemic rival, I think it's something relatively new that we should fully factor in our relationship with China. This being said, you cannot solve the climate change problem without China. You cannot reform WTO without China. You cannot address a number of issues without China, but at the same time, you need to stand by your principles and your values, and when needed, confront China with our differences.
Yes, because China is certainly interested in influencing trade and technology and trying to change the rules at the moment on that. So this is a time when we are going to have to work very closely with between the US, UK, and EU to make sure that we stick to having our systems in that. So I think that's quite important. You mentioned climate change, because that again is the other sort of elephant in the room, as you might describe it, because climate change is perhaps one of the biggest challenges for the younger generation and the one that they're most interested in. How can we make it go faster than, net zero by 2050? Do you think we can convince places like India and China to reform faster?
Well, I think this is the biggest challenge of all, and that this generation is confronted with. If we want the next generation to have the quality of life we expect them to have, and the planet to basically survive. If you allow me a more personal experience, back in, I think, 2005, 6, 7, including with the British presidency of the European Union, we launched the first, significant package of against climate change. Europe was a leader on this, and I remember, and I was at that time I had to negotiate some of them internationally. We were pretty isolated. We were, almost alone in the world with these kind of concerns and with this kind of. Certainly, Americans were not there. I can guarantee you, they were only there very late into or well into the Obama administration, and China, of course, was nowhere to be seen on climate change at that time. We've come a long way, and I think if there is a merit that should be recognized, acknowledged here, is the fact that Europe, together with UK, was still a member. We had the leadership on this, and we continue to have, and we are very proud of that. Now we have the US on board. Great. We have China on board with some differences, and we have many other countries around the world. And the challenge for Glasgow, and looking forward to attending in November, the challenge for Glasgow is to move forward. The challenge is next door. I mean, we've seen what's happening in climate events this year. And the urgency is there. So this requires international cooperation. This requires the multilateral framework to work. Again, a big challenge, top of the list. But for instance, this is an area where the West needs to consolidate its unity of purpose.
Yeah. So I mean, this is one of the biggest areas where I think looking at how the EU, UK, bearing in mind we're concentrating on this area, and the US working very closely together can be real leaders. And this is where perhaps the leadership will come in. But then at the same time, you've got all these other things maneuvering, like terrorism, as you mentioned earlier, and trade deals and the rise of China. But at the end of the day, we're all one planet. And how to get that message over to every country that unless we get our act together on that side, then there's no point doing any of the other bits that people are so interested in. So
yeah, I mean, we have to continue to lead. We have to continue to lead by example.
Yeah,
we cannot abandon that, because otherwise we weaken our capacity to lead. But we cannot do it alone. I mean, our contribution to climate change is not very important, relatively speaking. So our role is to bring the others along. And that requires a number of conditions, from financing to regulatory, to incentives, to mitigation, adaptation. It's a very complex agenda, but it's the real challenge that we have to face. But let me say the second one, I'll say with a global dimension, and following Afghanistan, maybe with a more acute sense of urgency, is fighting terrorism. And this again requires international multilateral efforts. If you think of cybersecurity, for instance, as well. So there's a lot on the plate that requires the countries that we live and represent. I mean, the EU, the UK, the US, to first to be united, to be cohesive, to be able to cooperate among themselves, exercise leadership, and my hope is that the events in Afghanistan would not make it more difficult.
Yes, I mean, Afghanistan is perhaps one of the last old-fashioned type wars that we have, because it is going to be the cyber threat. that is going to be the next one. And as soon as the terrorists, which they probably already are, but the non-state actors getting their act together as far as cyber terrorism goes, then we really are in a pickle, I think. Is there any organization that really is working very hard on this that we can promote, or as a group of countries that we should be focusing on?
I think there are a number of efforts. If I remember my time in the United Nations, with this Secretary General, they developed a new line of action on counterterrorism that did not exist before. We have a number of bodies and entities at different levels, multilateral, plurilateral, bilateral, that address terrorism, and the number of coalitions of the willing, as you know. I think we need to step up this, unfortunately, because, as you said, traditional wars are traditional wars.
Yes.
The wars of the generation that is listening to us will be very different wars, from cyber to bio to whatever they will invent in the future. This will be much more difficult to counter. We sometimes don't even know who our enemy is, right? In the old days, we have an arm in front of an army, Waterloo, whatever. You could see the enemy across the road or across the fields. Sometimes you don't know you don't know who your enemy is. Non-state actors, the links between terrorism and organized crime, whatever. So this is much more sophisticated. This only goes in the direction of more and better international cooperation. So everything we do to strengthen, consolidate international, multilateral, plurilateral, bilateral, regional cooperation, that's why the EU makes such a lot of sense, because countries alone cannot tackle these kind of issues alone. It's impossible. Simply, even big countries cannot do that. So that's the sense of, that's why the EU exists. And that's the sense of our sort of investment and insistence on multilateral institutions. If I give you the topics of our recently agreed transatlantic agenda already with the Biden administration, I have, everything linked to COVID plus, COVID, management of COVID plus. I have climate change. I have technology, trade, and regulatory issues. You mentioned them, extremely important. If you add artificial intelligence to that. And then you have the support for democracy and human rights. 4 items that give you, that we've just agreed with US, and I'm sure, I hope, and I'm sure that we will continue on that track in spite of Afghanistan. This gives you an idea of, the complexity of the international agenda these days, and how much we need to concentrate our efforts there.
But it's interesting because on my Royal College of Defence Studies course, of course, there are leaders from potential leaders from all over the world, and out of the challenges you've just mentioned, all of them, the cyber, COVID, and China, etc., and populism. Those were all the main topics that came up for which people had to, which people chose as their 2 main challenges, which was quite interesting. So, talking about the strength of multilateral things, let's now put the sort of the UK and the EU. And you're the EU ambassador to the UK. What more can we do then to strengthen it? Because moving forward now, we have to work together. There's no doubt about it. Obviously, we're going to work very differently. So what are the ways that we can really strengthen that to make sure from a multilateral point of view that we're making the most of this relationship?
Well, you're talking to someone who believes in the relevance of the European-British relationship. I believe it's good for us, good for you, and good for the world. So modestly, I'm trying to contribute to make this relationship work in a new framework. And we need to be very clear. One thing is to be a member, the other is to be a non-member, to be a third country. And decisions have consequences. So you cannot I think that's what we teach our children. I'm sure that's what you teach in your classes. That's valid for foreign policy as well. Like Afghanistan has shown, decisions have consequences, and Brexit has a number of consequences that leads to the reality that the fact that this relationship will be a different one from the one we had before for 47 years. So that should be the starting point. But once we start from there, in a pragmatic way, we have to see in this new framework, with the agreements that we have reached, how can we make this work for, mutual benefit? And that is my focus, right? I am sometimes a little frustrated because I see in the debate, people going back to old disputes or trying to score points on issues of the past. I want to focus on the future, and on the basis of what we have agreed, following a democratic decision by the British people, let's try to make it work. And that includes, in my view, in our view, should include foreign policy, security, international relations, everything we've been talking about. And I hope, and I'm sure, but that's up for the UK to decide, that there are good reasons, and certainly following Afghanistan, even more reasons for us to work together on that front as well, apart from all the other issues that we have already agreed upon to work. So I'm hopeful, I'm committed to the quality of this relationship. I think it makes every day more sense that we try to focus on the future instead of the past.
So we've just got a question here. All right. What do you see as the next geographical flashpoint? What keeps you awake at night? Is it the Taiwan, the Baltics, Korea, the Middle East?
Well, in Europe, we have to have of our first concern, our neighborhood, for obvious reasons, right? Any conflict, any tension, any eruption in our neighborhood has an immediate effect upon us. So, of course, if you go around Europe, you see Ukraine, you see Crimea, you see the Eastern Mediterranean, you see Libya, God knows, you see the Balkans, you see the migration pressure. So there's plenty for us to be worried about and concerned and committed to in our neighborhood. And that's basically the first ring of concern that we have. If I go in a wider angle, wider spectrum, of course, all we said about the transatlantic relationship is very important. Relations with UK, our friends and allies, that goes without saying. And then there's Africa, short term, medium term, long term, a huge priority for all the reasons, or some of the reasons we mentioned, and others. And then Asia and Southeast Asia in particular. And of course, we are following attentively the situation there. We know the concerns of the United States and many others. We have to focus there as well. But I don't want to predict the next crisis because you always get it wrong.
What about Russia then? Because that you've talked about being on our doorstep. Russia is a worry for me from a cybersecurity point of view and cyber threat, and their influence perhaps on elections, and the way they're using technology to perhaps have much more influence than we know about. Do you think that really is a priority for the EU as much as the UK at the moment?
It's certainly a priority. I mean, there's one thing you cannot change, and that's geography. We have thousands of kilometers of border with Russia. Russia won't go away. Russia is, to a large extent, part of European civilization. So, it's as the French will say, incontournable. You cannot ignore it. You cannot avoid it. You have to deal with it. The last few years have been difficult for obvious reasons, and particularly since the invasion of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, which was a game changer in our relationship with Russia. There are different dimensions: economic, political, strategic, you name it, energetic as well. So it's a complex one. But also in Europe, we have, if you take the 27 countries, very different degrees of knowledge, dependency, relationship with Russia. So for us, it's not always obvious to find a common ground among the 27 on Russia. We do have one. We have a doctrine about Russia that everybody pursues, but it's not difficult to handle because of the diversity of our geographic positions and historic links with Russia. But it's certainly a priority, and we need to continue to deal with Russia, but we need to be very clear on values and principles as we are.
So looking at the Baltic states, who are particularly worried, I think, quite often about Russia, is it NATO or the EU that's going to strengthen their borders for them?
I think the Baltics are a good example of what I was saying earlier, that you need both NATO and the EU. And a better EU means a better NATO and vice versa. So I think the Baltics is a good example of that. It was extremely important that they joined the European Union. It was an historic decision, and we are very proud of that. And it has enormous security implications, as we know. But their belonging to NATO is equally important and relevant. So it's a good example where the two elements of NATO and the EU come together in a positive way.
And the Ukraine as well. I mean, how are we going to strengthen, their government, and help them as well? I mean, have the EU got any plans to help in the Ukraine?
Absolutely. Ukraine is one of our most important close neighbors. As you know, we have a very ambitious agenda. Our leaders were just there in Ukraine for a commemoration, and we are absolutely investing in Ukraine. But again, this is another area where we need to act together with the UK and the United States, for instance, just to talk about the three who are the subject of this discussion. Where the coordinated action is absolutely necessary. We have the Minsk process that continues to evolve, but this is a main area of concern for us in our neighborhood.
And because of America's, looking at the South China Sea, do you think that we're going to have to spend more of our own money on security and on our military in Europe and the UK? Is this the area where we're going to have to step up and pay a lot more?
I think the trend is very clear, and we are in the European Union. We have done a lot in the last 5-6 years. Actually, after the UK left, because, as you know, there was some reticence on the UK side in some of these areas. In the meantime, we have done a lot in the broad area of security and defense, creating new instruments, providing us with supplementary budget, financial means to address this. If you take the industrial side, the research and innovation side, the cooperation among armies, the build-up of EU capacities and capabilities in terms of foreign action and security and defense. New ideas are on the table now. And I expect the events in Afghanistan, as I was saying earlier, to accelerate this. First, the awareness of the need for the EU to be more capable. And secondly, the willingness, the political will from our member states to invest politically and financially in that trend. So I would expect in the next few years, in my personal opinion, I would hope that the Union would step up its efforts on the external front. I think this could be the new frontier of European construction in the coming years, in the coming decade.
And will you be asking for help from the UK on that too? Because it's in our interest to get those borders strengthened as well. I mean, how, have you had any discussions with the UK government about that?
I mean, as you know, within the negotiations of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, all the agreements negotiated after Brexit, we suggested a foreign policy, security, defense cooperation framework. and we were ready to discuss that and negotiate the terms of that relationship. The UK, unfortunately, in my view, in our view, declined. Okay, we took note, but the door is still open.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's well heard, I think. There are a couple of questions because I know we're running out of time now. I mean, I've got loads of more questions, but I better just see what other people are asking. Someone says, is the one area where the US particularly interested is coordinated action to deal with market distorting practices, particularly from China. The EU is designing a number of trade and investment tools to address these issues by creating anti-coercion instruments. We've sort of talked about that before because China is very keen on changing the trade, investment and technology governance. They're really trying to influence it at the moment. Yeah. How strong do you think the the EU is to combat that? Well, UK...
we are the biggest internal market in the world. We are a regulatory soft power. Someone at Columbia, a professor, has named it the Brussels effect. What Brussels decides in terms of norms and standards and regulation has a global impact. And we are very proud of that. And we are certainly going to use that and other means to counter these kind of practices. But we know that we need to do more. And that's why reform of WTO is a priority for us. You cannot do it without China, but you can create a coalition of partners that can put more pressure on those who are less willing to do so. And that's again where Transatlantic, including the UK, comes to the fore. With the US, we have agreed to create a Trade and Technology Council, which exactly will address this kind of issues. So I hope that, but this is just me speaking, that we can also have this kind of discussions with the United Kingdom or even on a triangular base. But, to triangulate, you need three.
Yes. Okay. Point taken as well. I mean, there's all sorts of pressure that we perhaps need to put on because from my point of view, working with other people from multilateral thing, which is very much in our integrated review as well.
Yes.
So it's been really interesting because it's great to hear such positivity coming out. Even today, when we've just had a week of negative vibes, perhaps you can call it, coming out of all different sorts of countries, to have someone who's so positive working for the EU in the UK, I think, at this particular time.
My point is the alternative to being positive is negative.
Is there anything else you'd like to say? We've got about 2 minutes left.
I just want to, first of all, congratulate the promoters of this initiative. I know some of them personally. I want to salute the younger people. My generation, my father's generation, we've done a few things for Europe, including for UK, all of us together. The next generation will have a number of challenges. And I feel it as my duty, but also a pleasure to share some of our experience so that they are even better than us, well equipped to confront these new challenges.